Hello gamers, it's nobody's favorite YouTuber Dude Dog here. Today I'm going to be talking about recent indie horror sensation Choo Choo Charles. I've been following this game's development since its inception on 2Star's YouTube channel, and I recommend to check out his devlogs if you haven't already. It gives you a lot of insight into the game and why some things are the way they are. I also want to give a big thank you to PB Horror Gaming for letting me use their footage. Okay, where to start? Oh yeah, the start. You start off by getting a call from your friend Eugene to come to this island and kill this demonic spider train, known as Charles. And for some godforsaken reason, you without hesitation agree and travel to the island. Here you're given some basic tutorials and introduced to the questing system. Your first quest is to retrieve a key from a shack to gain access to your train. Yes, it's the most bog standard fetch quest imaginable, but it's only the first. I'm sure they'll get more complex later on. That's called foreshadowing! After this, you get access to the best part of this entire game, your train. If this game does one thing well, it's definitely the train. Everything on the train, from moving backwards and forwards to mounting your gun, is done by walking up to and manually using them. It sounds small, but it makes it feel much more like you're operating a vehicle than if these actions were achieved through, say, button inputs. Despite this game's flaws, which I will get into later, stepping away from your train controls and walking up to your deck, trying to keep an eye out for any loot or hazards, is an experience you really can't get anywhere else, and a very welcome one at that. After checking out your train, you and Eugene take it on a hunting trip. Fortunately, your prey arrives very soon. Unfortunately, your good friend Eugene underestimated the powers of a demonic spider train. This is your first encounter with Charles, and it's the only scripted one in the game, bar the final. The game's train combat is fun, and can create some interesting dynamic set pieces, but is also quite shallow. I'll get into why later. So, Eugene gets killed, says some stuff about finding 3 eggs, which will act as 3 of the 5 main missions, and thus, you're left free into the open world to do as you please. Well, do as you please in quotation marks. There's not all that much you can do, apart from going forwards or backwards, and picking up quests along the way. But going forwards is almost certainly the intended route, as that's where the tutorials and some essential items are given. The first side quest the player will most likely encounter teaches you about scrap, which is the game's leveling system. Basically, you can pick up scrap from the ground, find it in randomly spawning caches, or get it for completing quests. With this scrap, you can upgrade your train's speed, damage, and defense. By the end of the game, you'll ideally have everything maxed out. There's not really going to be any builds or anything, which, don't get me wrong, is a good thing. An in-depth skill tree really wouldn't add anything to the game, except needless complexity. Where I do have issue, however, is the quest itself. The player is tasked with walking into a building to retrieve some scrap. This is sadly how almost every single quest plays out, even the main and the weapon quests. You go into a place, get a thing, and that's the quest. I can only really think of 3 quests that deviate, and one of them is the final. This is just hands down boring, and is the game's biggest issue. I definitely feel there should have been some missions that took advantage of the train, because the game's on-foot gameplay is just quite uninteresting. After another side quest giving you lockpicks, and a quite well done and non-intrusive lockpicking minigame, the player will most likely arrive at their first weapon quest. There are 3 in total, and they are basically the exact same as side quests, except you get a weapon instead of scrap. These weapons can be used against Charles, and ideally, you'll want to get at least 2 of them. After this, if the player once more follows the main path, they'll be introduced to their first main mission. Main missions are like side missions, except they feature the worst stealth system known to man. Maybe that's a little harsh, but it's also true. I've genuinely not played a game with worse stealth, which pains me to say knowing how much work was put into the cultist AI. Basically, you have to walk around these small maze-like caves filled with enemy cultists. If you see an enemy, you're basically caught. You're encouraged to lean around corners to check where enemies are, and avoid them, but 90% of the time you'll check a corner and you'll see an enemy walking towards you, at which point you have almost no way to avoid getting caught. You can't even crouch to lower your chances of being spotted, let alone fight back against the cultists. You're just screwed. The stealth does have some glimpses of good design. For example, listening to enemies whistling to find out where they are can be really fun, and is the easiest way to avoid them. But there's a level of randomness to if the enemies even whistle in the first place, and even if there wasn't, it still wouldn't save the stealth as a whole. The final component of this game is the encounters with Charles himself. Another highlight. I think he's the saving grace for this game's uninteresting quest design. Charles is constantly roaming the overworld, and if he sees the player, he'll make chase. There also seems to be a system where every 20 to 30 minutes he teleports somewhere near the player. This means no matter where you are, you're never really safe. And it's this anxiety that really sells the game for me. Anytime you're outside your train, you have no way to fight back against Charles. If you're out in the open and Charles appears, you will die. This causes a looming sense of dread anytime you have to leave your train, whether it be to diverge the railways or do a quest. Like I said before, this is the saving grace for these quests. At least for the first playthrough. This dread really sells the game's atmosphere and helps the dull quests remain interesting. However, it still has its problems. One of the biggest problems is one that sadly every horror game faces. After you die enough times, it just stops being scary. This could have been mitigated by the fact that you lose scrap every time you die. The amount you lose is so small, it really doesn't matter. But since you lose so little, it also makes it less cheap when you die. It's a double-edged sword. Now let's talk about what happens when you get to your train before Charles manages to kill you. This is where the game's train combat takes place, and I have mixed feelings on it. Here you'll use your arsenal of weapons against Charles, to simultaneously keep him away from your train, while also damaging him. Once he gets to about 3/4 of his health, he'll flee. What stops you from using the same weapon the entire time is overheating. Each weapon will overheat after you use it for a few seconds, so you need to go back into your train and select a new weapon. You'll also want to enter your train every once in a while to use scrap to heal your train, as if Charles gets close enough to you, he will attack you. This all seems fun on paper, but the problem is, once you figure out a strategy to keep Charles at bay, you will not deviate from that strategy. Every Charles encounter will be the exact same, the only difference is what gear you have at the time. Sadly, there's not much skill involved. Either you have the equipment to deal with him, and you win, or you don't, and you die. I suppose you have to be accurate to deal maximum damage, but that's sort of the bare minimum. The other big problem is after your first few encounters, it just becomes annoying. You must constantly be moving forwards during the encounters, or you'll get killed. So, if you were just about to go to a quest location, and Charles shows up, you're probably going to end up on the other side of the map by the end of it, and have to go all the way back after. So to conclude, while the train combat is fun the first few times, it really doesn't have much staying power. Actually, I think that's a good way to sum up the whole game. Choo Choo Charles is really fun in my first playthrough, maybe even scary, but after that, it just becomes a slog. This game ended just about the right time, to the point where if you only played the game once, you'd most likely have a pretty high opinion on it. The only problem is the game is 2 hours, and it's $20 USD. This is way too high for a short and barely replayable game such as Choo Choo Charles. The game is fun and has its moments, but for the price it's not worth it. Wait for a sale or something.